professor of law and the associate dean for research at the University of Colorado. He is currently writing a book on the Little Steel Strike of 1937. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Ahmed White.
Quickly, a number of archives, including some locally, who've been of great assistance to me in developing the project on which I'll base, at least in part, today's talk. That includes, of course, the Ohio Historical Society, the Western Reserve Historical Society, the Youngstown Center for Industry and Labor, and the Penn State Library, the Joe Paterno Library at Penn State, all of whom have been very helpful to me in developing the material that I'm going to talk about. And so you've heard a fair bit already about the Little Steel Strike. I'm going to tell you more. I'm going to talk about 35 minutes or so, hopefully not too long, about the strike, but that's my mission today, and I've got some photographs that will accompany the talk. So here it is. I'd never seen the police beat women, not white women. A worker named Jesse Reese marveled as he crawled through the grass under a brilliant afternoon sun on a desolate field in the southernmost reaches of the city of Chicago. It was Memorial Day, May 30th, 1937. All around Reese, a scene of extraordinary violence unfolded as scores of club-wielding police not only beat people, men and women, black as well as white, but also fired gas weapons and firearms, striking down dozens. Reese, a black man and a fugitive from a Mississippi chain gang a few years earlier, was no stranger to brutality or injustice. And yet he was stunned as he beheld hundreds of victims of this onslaught, unarmed and helpless, running and stumbling and crying out in shock and pain as the police descended on them. Moments earlier, Reese had been firmly on his feet, one of at least 1,500 demonstrators who had marched to within several hundred feet of the gate of a steel mill owned by the Republic Steel Corporation. The demonstrators' cause was industrial unionism. Earlier that afternoon, they had rallied at an old tavern, which served as local headquarters for the union that had called the strike against Republic. Reese himself, a union worker and organizer at a nearby plant, had arrived at the rally with truckloads of other strikers. From the tavern, a place called Sam's Place, he and the other demonstrators had walked down the street 5 or 6 blocks and then marched diagonally across a field towards the mill's gate. It was about 4 in the afternoon. In addition to strikers from Republic and their families, demonstrators' ranks included workers from other steel companies and other industries, as well as unemployed folk, students, churchmen, political activists, journalists, social workers. Ethnically and racially diverse, the demonstrators were mostly men, but there were at least 100 and maybe as many as several hundred women as well. There was even a smattering of children, brought along by some who viewed the holiday protest as the occasion for a festive outing. As it made its way across to the far corner of the field, a throng of demonstrators fanned out into a ragged column, flanked by smaller groups, all moving toward the gate. They were led by 2 men bearing American flags, both strikers and one of them a Mexican national. The crowd intermittently chanted slogans as they marched, the main refrain a reference to the labor federation that sponsored their efforts. CIO, CIO. The demonstrators' aim that afternoon was certain, at least to themselves. They intended to assert their right under federal law, as they saw it, to establish a large picket line at Republic's gate. To that end, many carried signs denouncing the steel company or proclaiming their right to picket. A handful had armed themselves with sticks and rocks, and many must have expected the march to provoke some kind of fracas with the police, at least when the crowd closely approached the plant gate. But few of them could have anticipated what awaited. Stationed between the approaching throng and the mill gate were about 250 uniformed members of the Chicago Police Department, armed with revolvers, nightsticks, hatchet handles, and various gas weapons, some provided by Republic Steel. The police were positioned a few hundred feet from the mill gate, ready to intercept the demonstrators. Behind them, at the gate and beyond the barbed wire top fence that bounded the mill, were dozens of Republic's own police, armed with gas weapons, billy clubs, and firearms. About 1,000 workers at the mill had defied the call to strike and remained inside the plant. At least 100 and maybe many hundreds of these men were also armed. Some of them were intent on watching the confrontation unfold. Others lurked about in a menacing fashion. Little of this was apparent to the Union people until they began to make their way across the field. As the first of the demonstrators reached the police position, the foremost representatives on each side faced off with the police. They formed ragged lines facing each other. Immediately, arguments erupted as the demonstrators demanded their right to picket the gate, and the police refused them passage, insisting that they disperse. After a few minutes, the standoff exploded in the flash of violence that left Jesse Reese crawling in the grass. With little, if any, provocation, the police fired their revolvers and gas weapons into the assemblage of strikers and supporters, killing 4 men outright, mortally wounding 6 others, and inflicting gunshot wounds on some 30 men, women, and children. By some accounts, the shooting began after a police captain dramatically lowered the paper from which he had just read an order commanding the demonstrators to disperse. Others suggested there was a little shoving, or maybe the shooting started after someone lobbed a rock or a stick from the demonstrators' rearmost ranks. Who knows? However it started, what unfolded was simply appalling. The demonstrators fell as though they were being mowed down with a scythe, a victim named Harry Harper recalled. Films and testimony of numerous witnesses document a horrific scene as the demonstrators' raucous shouting, smiling faces, and relaxed, upright demeanors were reduced in an instant to overwhelming expressions of shock and fear and contortions of panic and agony. Those who were able to run fled in fear, most with little hesitation. Many were unable to run because they had been seriously injured or, like Jesse Reese, had been knocked to the ground. Others, showing great courage, went straight to the aid of shocked or wounded comrades. Still others from the broken crowd simply stood in place, stunned by the dire circumstances enveloping them. The police rushed forth into this chaotic mass of people, some firing more shots from their revolvers, while others beat the demonstrators, men and women, wounded and able-bodied, and manhandled dozens, wounded included, into waiting patrol wagons. Some of the police exulted as they attacked the helpless and compliant Unionists, or were consumed by rage. Others went about this business in a seemingly detached, workmanlike fashion. A small few seemed shocked themselves by what was happening. When, after several minutes, the violence finally waned, about 200 gunshots had been fired, all by the police, and around 100 demonstrators had been hurt, beyond those already dead or mortally wounded. The police suffered only about 30 injuries, none of them very serious. A signal moment in the history of labor and class conflict, familiar to many of you, the Memorial Day Massacre, as it came to be called, was but one of many angry clashes in a bitter and prolonged strike in the summer of 1937. The Little Steel Strike, as we know it, pitted steelworkers aligned with the Steelworkers Organizing Committee, the SWOC, of the Committee for Industrial Organizing, the CIO, against a group of powerful steel companies. The companies, Republic, Bethlehem, Youngstown Sheet and Tube, and Inland, were dubbed Little Steel only to distinguish them from the enormous U.S. Steel, Big Steel, as every one of these companies ranked among the 100 largest firms in America. Under the leadership of Republic's Tom Girdler, the companies were interlinked with other capitalist interests, including powerful trade groups and business organizations, the DuPont family, the Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, the Iron and Steel Institute. This coalition of capitalists was intent on using the strike to mount what one commentator called at the time an armed revolt on the right. The SWOC was created in the spring of 1936 by the CIO, whose founding father, John L. Lewis, viewed the successful organization of Basic Steel's 500,000 workers as a vital step in the CIO's campaign to fully organize the industrial workforce. At its birth, the CIO was placed under the leadership of Lewis's protégés, including its chairman, Philip Murray. The SWAC launched a strike against Little Steel on May 26, 1937, after a year's struggle to organize the company's workforce. The striking steelworkers' ultimate aims varied, but they centered on resisting workplace conditions that were comprehensively awful. Conditions in the plants were so dangerous and arduous that men were regularly removed on stretchers. And few could expect to work more than 10 years or so without suffering a serious injury. Pay was low, even by Depression standards. Hiring, firing, and promotion practices were arbitrary, with many men uncertain they'd be hired on any given day. And they were also discriminatory, especially against blacks and downcast ethnics. Frequently, discipline in the mills consisted of beatings and other forms of violence administered by foremen. The strikers' more immediate goals were to establish the right to build an independent union, to provoke meaningful collective bargaining, and to protest by striking and picketing. These rights had been enacted into federal law 2 years earlier via the Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act, which was a centerpiece of the Roosevelt administration's so-called Second New Deal, and which, to the surprise of most, had been held constitutional by the United States Supreme Court only weeks before the strike began in the landmark decision NLRB versus Jones and Laughlin Steel. But as the men who ran the steel company saw things, the letter of the law could not trump their prerogatives as industrial capitalists. The steel industry had a long tradition of violent hostility to organized labor, encompassing the events at Homestead in 1892, in which over a dozen people were killed. The East Youngstown strike of 1916 in what's now Campbell, in which several workers were shot dead. As well as the Great Steel Strike of 1919, a nationwide struggle to organize the industry in which nearly 20 workers were killed by company guards, vigilantes, and corrupted police. True to this tradition, the steel industry aggressively resisted the SWAC's organizing efforts and emphatically rejected the union's demands. From the summer of 1936 through the spring of 1937, the 400 paid SWAC organizers and 5,000 volunteers who aided them were relentlessly harassed, threatened, and frequently beaten as they worked the mills and mill towns. The companies defied the Wagner Act and the authority of the federal agency charged with enforcing it, the National Labor Relations Board, or NLRB, and they bucked a trend among other large industrial employers during that period, including U.S. Steel, which had begun to retreat from decades of absolute opposition to basic labor rights. The little steel companies finally provoked a strike in May 1937 by relentless persecution of organizers and SWAC supporters, culminating in lockouts in Canton and Massillon. Acting in concert, Little Steel justified their position by the absurd pretext that although they were inclined to bargain with and even contract with the SWAC, which was a lie, the labor law, they said, did not mandate that these collective bargaining agreements be written out and signed. That was their position. The Little Steel strike involved around 30 mills in 7 states, although it was centered in the Calumet region around the southern shores of Lake Michigan and, of course, here in northeast Ohio. At its height in June 1937, about 80,000 steel workers, including 45,000 here in Ohio, were off the job, along with at least 10,000 CIO miners, rubber workers, and other sympathy strikers. Although many steel workers were passive participants, and thousands of loyalists opposed the strike, tens of thousands of strikers embraced the union's cause. The strikers and their families endured extended periods of privation and hardship. Together with their supporters, they picketed plant gates for weeks and even months in the face of widespread threats, provocations, and assaults. They tried desperately to inflict economic damage on the companies. Excuse me 1 second. And they took the offensive against the companies and their supporters. Throughout the strike zone, they established intimidating mass picket lines. They organized sympathy strikes, including in Youngstown and around Johnstown, Pennsylvania. And they engaged in acts of sabotage. This was the case here in Cleveland and around Canton and Massillon. It was also true in the area around Youngstown and Warren and Niles especially, where strikers under the leadership of local rank-and-file workers and a core of radical organizers that included communists Gus Hall, Robert Burke and John Shorty Steuben, mounted a sustained campaign to quarantine several mills that Republic insisted on running during the strike. So successful was their use of mass picketing, assaults on scabs, and sabotage that for several weeks in June, Republic could only supply loyal employees at its mills in Warren and Niles by means of a fleet of 14 airplanes obtained for this purpose. And only with great difficulty, as Union gunmen sniped at the planes, chased them down with their own aircraft, and were shot at in turn by heavily armed company police. The violence and brutality of the Little Steel Strike are legendary. According to U.S. Senate investigators, at the height of the conflict, in Ohio alone, Republican sheet and tube directly controlled 2,400 armed men, and were backed by thousands of guardsmen and public police in addition to that, many of the latter from forces that the companies had bribed with cash and weapons. Republican sheet and tube each stocked their plants with around 1,000 firearms and many thousand gas weapons. Time and again, attempts to push aside picketers and other provocative acts by company agents resulted in bloody clashes. On June 10th, Unionists at a Republic plant in Monroe, Michigan were routed by several hundred special police, organized and armed at company expense. On the evening of June 19th, a city policeman allied with Republic tear gassed a group of women on the picket line on Poland Avenue in Youngstown, setting off a gun battle between Union men and company police, as well as city police and sheriff's deputies. The so-called Stop 5 riot lasted through the night and left 2 strikers dead. On June 28th, a disabled worker and Union supporter was killed in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, after being struck in the head by a gas projectile fired by police pushing aside picketers at a Republic plant. On June 30th, in the wake of a violent clash that followed on the attempts of National Guardsmen to rout picketers near Republic's complex in Canton, a striker was found dead, apparently beaten by guardsmen. On June 11th, city police and special police, under the control of an agent of Republic, and without any real provocation, attacked an assemblage of strikers at Massillon, killing 2 men. Finally, on the evening of July 26th, here in Cleveland, at the main gate of Republic's, near the main gate of Republic's Corrigan McKinney Works, near the intersection of Dale Avenue and Independence Road, a riotous confrontation unfolded between mass picketers and company loyalists and police. During the melee, which culminated in an all-night riot that flooded area hospitals, a striker was run over and killed by loyal employees by a loyal employee who pushed through the picket line in his car. By the time the strike ended later that summer, at least 16 people, all Unionists, had lost their lives. Well over 300 people had been badly injured, and as many as 2,000 had been arrested in dozens of confrontations between Union people on the one hand, and public and company police, guardsmen, and loyal employees on the other. Eventually, over a dozen men, all Unionists, were sent to prison for strike violence, mostly here in Ohio. The strike was broken, not least because of the actions of Pennsylvania Governor George Earle and Ohio Governor Martin Davey, both New Deal Democrats. On June 19th and June 21st, Davey and then Earle effectively declared martial law. Earle in Johnstown, Davey in an area centered around Youngstown, Warren, and Niles. They did so, the governor said, to prevent a conflagration, as the companies mustered thousands of police, loyal employees, and vigilantes to support their vow to reopen the mills, most of which, I should say, had been closed when the strike began. And Union people gathered in equal numbers to resist it. For several days, troopers in both states enforced status quo orders, they were called, that kept most of the plants closed while clearing away mass picketers and disarming strikers, although not company agents. All of this in the name of settling things down and giving federal mediation efforts space to succeed. But faced with the failure of these efforts and the continuous pressure from companies and their allies, on June 24th, Davey lifted the status quo order and reassigned the guards to overseeing the reopening of the plants. Earle followed suit the next day, and in the next few weeks, Davey redeployed the guards to the Canton-Massillon area and later here to Cleveland, also to oversee the reopening. Altogether, over 5,000 guardsmen were deployed in Ohio, and about 500 state police in Pennsylvania. The actions of these governors was a crushing blow to the SWAT, which had expected more from these two New Deal Democrats. Worse still was the ambivalence of FDR, who at a June 29th press conference summoned Shakespeare and declared the strike a plague on both your houses, meaning the CIO and the steel companies. Never mind the key role the CIO played in his re-election the previous year, FDR did next to nothing to aid the union. With no help from the federal government and with state authorities now enforcing drastic limits on picketing and sympathy strikes, the strikers simply could not sustain the strike. Of the struck companies, only Inland Steel, which ran one large plant in the Calumet, surrendered anything to the SWAT, and only at the urging of Indiana Governor Clifford Townsend. The other companies yielded nothing. The union's defeat reflected the vulnerability of the strikers, who on the one hand were prevented by the forces of law and order from keeping the mills closed and pressuring the companies, and on the other were faced with mounting bills and the threat of hunger and homelessness, and simply could not outlast Little Steel. Even before the July 26 riot here in Cleveland, the strike was broken just about everywhere. Afterwards, the companies, mainly Republic, effectively fired upwards of 8,000 strikers, about 5,000 here in Ohio, as it refused to take them back when the strike ended. In the fall of 1938, faced with NLRB orders, finding that this action violated the Wagner Act, Republic partly relented, taking back about half these workers. In the next couple of years, in a piecemeal way, Republic reinstated most of the remaining workers. Although most of these men expected to receive back pay for the time they were unlawfully denied their jobs, as the law seemed to mandate, only about half did. And they received much less money than they had expected and complained bitterly about this, writing letters in to the union. In all, Republic paid out $1.5 million in back pay and lost vacation pay to some 2,900 workers, mostly from Ohio. This works out to about $300 per man. The checks were not mailed out until Thanksgiving 1941, 4 years after the strike, more than 4 years after the strike. Although the $1.5 million paid by Republic stands even today as among the largest remedial awards ever awarded under the labor law, the figure represents only 0.6% of the $252 million in revenue and 17% of the $9 million in profits that Republic took in the year of the strike alone. For the 5 years from the time of the strike to final settlement, when the checks were paid, company revenues and profits were $1.4 billion and $67 million. Sheeton, too, paid out only $170,000 to about 300 workers. The other companies paid nothing to anyone. In the wake of the strike, the SWAC and the CIO stood in disarray. It would take several years of litigation as well as changes in political economy brought about by the Second World War before the companies, presented now with the prospect of losing government contracts and increasingly subjected to a wartime production administration that effectively imposed union contract terms anyway, finally agreed to contract with the union and cease persecuting organizers. 5 years after the strike, in the late summer of 1942, all four companies signed with the union, now reorganized as the USWA. The Little Steel strike was by any reckoning a great tragedy. It has the distinction of being the deadliest strike, not only of the 1930s, but probably of the whole period from the early 1920s through the present day. The strike embodied class conflict on a scale and with a raw intensity seldom surpassed in American history. As recently as 15 or 20 years ago, as the surviving participants reached their twilight years and were interviewed about the event, they still remembered the strike as one of the most important episodes in their lives, and correctly saw it as a tremendous expression of class struggle. The surviving strikers, at least, knew that they had lived through a great and remarkable thing that deserved to be remembered after they were gone. Events like this one today aside, not everywhere has the Little Steel strike been so well honored in memory. Although professional historians, labor law scholars, and popular writers mention the conflict in virtually every history of labor relations or of the New Deal era, they have neglected to study the strike in a sustained way. The strike has garnered little focused attention outside of a few accounts of the Memorial Day massacre, including a recently published book, a couple of other localized studies in journals, and brief narratives and broader histories of the New Deal. Where the Little Steel Strike is mentioned, its events are often misunderstood, and its meaning and legacy are often miscast. It is common for scholars and other commentators to see the company's eventual concession to union recognition as a prominent symbol of the final victory of the CIO, of New Deal labor law, and of the NLRB over a deeply entrenched tradition of unqualified employer opposition to labor rights, one that had long presided in steel and other important industries. The struggle with Little Steel is folded by many into a larger dominant narrative about the triumph of industrial unionism in the late 1930s, becoming a temporary setback on a march to sweeping victory. In the same vein, some historians have actually argued that the strike boomeranged to the overall benefit of organized labor and the labor law. Its images of open class warfare supposedly warming the public and elites alike to the need for a functional system of labor rights. Consistent with these perspectives is the idea of the strike as a poorly timed and badly executed gambit on the part of the SWAC and the CIO, one which played into the company's strengths and which revealed more about the need for mature, they said, tactics and planning by industrial unionists than anything ominous about the depth and direction of change in New Deal America. There is much to say for this notion that the Little Steel Strike was a tragedy remediated eventually by triumph. Little Steel's belated surrender was an important and hard-won victory for labor rights, one which rested on the sacrifices of countless workers and union organizers, and the diligent efforts of NLRB staff. The company's eventual capitulation rightly symbolizes the last gasp of organized, large-scale violent resistance to labor rights, and the advent instead of a new era in industrial relations, defined by unprecedented reliance on collective bargaining, relatively peaceful labor disputes, and overall fidelity to the law. There is also considerable room to criticize the way the strike was planned and executed by unionists, radicals and moderates alike. Nevertheless, it's a mistake to see the strike simply as a delayed victory or as evidence of the superiority of responsible unionism and practical industrial relations over competing notions of class extremism. For entangled in and often obscured by these conventional accounts of the strike is a complex and sobering story, usually untold, which speaks different truths about the place of unions and the state of labor rights in modern America. Above all, the Little Steel Strike was a crucial episode in a larger struggle between industrial workers and capitalists to define the effective contours of labor rights and class relations in New Deal America. The strike was a key battleground in a grinding campaign to decide what sort of America would emerge out of the political and legal ferment of the New Deal, and out of the unprecedented outbreak of economic crisis, class conflict, and political struggle that characterized that era. In this regard, the Little Steel Strike was for labor and the cause of labor rights not merely a progression from defeat to victory or tragedy to triumph, but a display instead of the contradictory course of labor rights, class politics, and political economy at a pivotal time in American history. As the first major test of the NLRB and the Wagner Act after the Jones and Laughlin decision, the strike brought to light both the promises and shortcomings of the agency and the new labor law. On the one hand, the NLRB's diligent prosecutions of the Little Steel companies for their many violations of the Wagner Act, both in provoking the strike and with respect to their conduct during and after the strike, helped compel the companies to finally recognize and bargain with the USWA. The agency's success made clear that the new regime would have real value for as an institution of reform. And yet, anticipating problems that undermine labor rights to this day, this process took years and resulted in remedies that were generally inadequate. Even as agency lawyers, many of them leftists at this time, pushed the limits of the Wagner Act, as well as their own ethical obligations as lawyers, in a desperate effort to hold the companies to some account. In this way, the strike confirmed that the NLRB and the Wagner Act, while meaningful vehicles of reform, would neither fundamentally alter the contours of industrial relations nor displace capitalist hegemony in the workplace and in the larger political economy. On a broader plane, the Little Steel Strike also took the measure of the New Deal. It goes too far to say, as one authority does, that the strike signaled the beginning of the end of the New Deal. But the strike did reveal, and in some ways shape, the limits of the New Deal and the rightward trajectory of social policy that characterized the New Deal by the late 1930s. Little Steel's victory over the CIO confirmed how much power industrial capitalists retained despite the economic crisis and despite the work of the CIO. The strike inspired these capitalists to redouble their resistance to reform, even as they put aside the extreme violence that characterized the strike itself. Moreover, the strike caused a rupture in the alliance between the CIO and the Roosevelt administration, an alliance which had become a cornerstone of the New Deal and which had helped push the New Deal to the left in previous years. In all these respects, the strike can be seen as an important moment in the process, described by a number of prominent historians, including Alan Brinkley and Ellis Hawley, by which the New Deal in the late 1930s traded its early focus on the dangers of corporate power and its affinity for structural economic reforms for a program far less hostile to big business and more aligned with the ideals of Keynesianism, corporate consumerism, individual rights, and labor capital détente. The Little Steel strike also took the measure of the CIO, as well as its radical supporters. The strike did feature extraordinary bravery and solidarity on the part of organizers and rank-and-file workers. And it highlighted impressive successes on the part of the union in organizing a fractured and much persecuted workforce, including notable successes organizing blacks and downcast ethnics, who had tended until this time to reject unionism, in part because they were rejected by unions. This success was especially evident in Chicago, as well as here in Cleveland, where journalists were astonished to see blacks fighting blacks on the picket lines. But the strike also exposed the weakness of the CIO and the deficiencies of its leaders. In particular, the strike showed how much CIO leaders, including John L. Lewis and Philip Murray, overestimated the support they would receive from New Deal liberals. And it exposed how unprepared the likes of Lewis and Murray were for dealing with the kind of resistance they encountered with Little Steel. Riding a remarkable tide of victories capped by the General Motors sit-down strikes of the previous winter, but now faced with entrenched opposition backed by thousands of armed men and massive stores of political and economic power, CIO and SWAC leaders suddenly appeared inept and confused about how to proceed. They had no idea how to make the strike effective. Defeat, when it arrived, not only destroyed the drive in steel, it broke the CIO's momentum nationwide, diminished its leaders' already uncertain appetite for organizing by means of strikes, and drove the CIO and the SWAC to rely almost exclusively on the workings of the NLRB and other government agencies to achieve what had not been won on the picket lines. The war, above all, was the salvation of the CIO. In the meantime, the strike shaped the course of steel unionism, and not entirely for the better. The strike was also not a clear vindication of radicals or rank-and-file militants either, even though rank-and-filers led by radical organizers spearheaded some of the most resolute, courageous, and promising opposition to Little Steel, only to have their efforts disavowed by the SWAC's leadership, and in the case of radical organizers, themselves purged from the union as the strike wound down. For all their virtues, radical organizers, most of them connected to the Communist Party and located in the bottom rungs of the SWAC hierarchy, simply offered no viable alternative to the SWAC strategy for overcoming Little Steel's resistance, or rolling back the power of industrial capitalists more generally. In fact, more clearly than in any other strike during the 1930s or since, the Little Steel strike exposed a fundamental dilemma inherent in the very concept of labor militancy that these radicals tended to embrace, which is this. On the one hand, militant tactics like mass picketing and sabotage offered unionists a way of countering the steel company's inherent advantages in raw economic power, overcoming the limitations of the Wagner Act, and realizing an effective right to strike. But on the other hand, these very tactics played directly into the company's advantages in access to law enforcement and courts, whom they could corrupt, in political power, and in their capacity to manufacture opposition to the strike. For militancy begat the confrontations like the bloody clash on Memorial Day in Chicago, or those later that summer in Warren, Niles, Kent, Massillon, Youngstown, in which the companies, despite their own overwhelming culpability, from which the companies forged a potent narrative about strike violence that cast unionists as the enemies of public order, weakened support for the strike among elites and the public, and justified the wave of intervention by police and guardsmen that finished the strike. In the decade following the Little Steel Strike, this same disingenuous story about violence and labor rights became the centerpiece of a sustained attack on the NLRB and the Wagner Act, led again by steel companies and other powerful business groups, which cast the agency and the law as too indulgent of unions, especially CIO unions like the USWA, and therefore in need of dramatic reforms. In this way, the Little Steel Strike went on to play an important but perverse role in the enactment of the notoriously anti-union Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, as distorted accounts of the strike's violence were used then to justify important provisions of the new law, including limits on the right to strike. In all these ways, the Little Steel Strike was a critical moment in American history. The story of the strike is a study in the realities of class struggle and labor conflict, one that emphasizes the formative role that violence played in shaping labor rights. The strike is also a reminder from the past of the realities that bear unrelentingly on labor relations even today. Among them, the vast power that capital exerts on the fields of class conflict, and the constant threat this power poses to workers and to the viability of any system of labor rights. For all its uniqueness in time and place, the Little Steel Strike is, in the end, a testament to what is fundamentally ordinary about labor rights and class relations in this country. Although, like the larger story of the strike itself, this aspect of its history is much ignored by scholars and other commentators, it was not lost on the participants in the strike. Their recollections, which are available to us in several archives in this state, reveal this. For these men, the strike was long a source of pride and proof of their own potency as workers. And yet it also offered them indelible lessons about the power of the capitalists, the fickle role of law and the state in the arena of labor relations, the double-edged sword of militancy in this context, the contradictions of industrial unionism, and the precariousness of any functional system of labor rights in modern society. In testament to the potency of the Little Steel Strike as a seminal event in American history, these men's insights survived in their minds the post-war détente of labor and capital. The reinvention of the strike and official reflections on that time, if the strike's remembered at all, and the incessant claims of a culture which for the most part persistently denies that class could ever constitute an authentic framework of identity and consciousness. It is in these workers' understanding that one finds the essential truth of the Little Steel Strike and its profoundest lesson for all Americans, reflected so well in Upton Sinclair's words. The purpose of the strike is to teach you what capitalism really is, to free you from the accepted falsehoods of your class. Thank you.